Hello again, this is History 425. We're going to talk today about the end of the Mao era. This is History 425, Week 7, Part 1. That's what you should be looking at. Let's go on to Slide 2 and hope that YouTube stays with me here. I don't know why I even bother to say that. I only say that when I've tried once and been thrown out by YouTube. Someday I'm sure the whole online course thing will be much more regularized than it is. So I want to look at Slide 2 and clarify something that confuses a lot of people who read about China. And that is all these references concerning plenums. In particular, the Lushan plenum. There's more than one Lushan plenum. I've listed them all here, and I'm not going to read them to you and bore you. You can stop the audio and read about these if you want. You've seen references to several of them, not all of them, in your readings. For example, there was a Lushan plenum in 1961, which the communists call the second Lushan plenum because it was their second Lushan plenum. Their first Lushan plenum was the one that is most prominent in your readings in July-August 1959, during the beginning of the famine, during the Great Leap Forward, when Peng Dehuai, the Marshal Peng Dehuai, who was the defense minister, wrote his letter to Mao Zedong saying that people are starving, we've got to do something to change course. And then there's another one, the third plenum, as the communists will call it, in July 1970, which was to decide a dispute between Jiang Qing, Mao's wife, and Lin Biao, which ended up being the beginning of the end of Lin's career. So what is a plenum? A plenum is a meeting. If you look in a dictionary, you'll see several definitions of the word plenum. And these are meetings that come in between the major meetings of each Congress. So in this course, also to clarify another point, you've heard references to the first CCP Congress, the second CCP Congress, the fourth, the fifth, and so on. The first Chinese Communist Party Congress, which sent people to sit on the Central Committee, people who were locally elected, met in order to elect the leadership of the party. And that's what these congresses always do. Local representatives are elected to the Central Committee. Usually, of course, their names are put forward and everybody has to vote for them. Sometimes there's a little bit more of a democratic process involved, but anyway, they're sent to the Communist Party Congress and they elect the Politburo, and then they supposedly elect the Politburo Standing Committee. Of course, nowadays and most of the times in the past, people who were chosen rather than really elected and sent to Beijing or sent to the party center of the time to participate in these meetings were told what to do. They were told what the issues would be. They were told how to vote. And in some of these films you've seen that I've put up, it'll show everybody raising their hands all at once. This is the communist idea of the democratic process. So each one of these meetings, the prominent ones in our readings have been the first Communist Party Congress in Shanghai in July 1921, which was a clandestine meeting that had to be moved because the police discovered it and they almost got caught, the French concession police in Shanghai. There was a fourth Congress that was in Moscow because conditions in China were too difficult to hold a Chinese Communist Party Congress. There was the seventh Congress in 1945 that cemented Mao's political control. There was the 8th Congress in 1956. There was the 9th Congress that you've read about in 1971, rather in 1969, when Lin Biao was constitutionally declared the successor of Mao Zedong. And just 2 years later, Lin Biao was skeletal remains identifiable only by dental records strewn across the steppes of Mongolia after a plane crash in which he fled China. Poor Lin Biao. Anyway, these plenums are the occasional meetings of the Central Committee that occur in between the major congresses. That's all they are. Gets a little bit confusing. Going on to slide 3, I wanted to note that this practice of altering photographs for historical or political purposes is quite common, so you can't really trust necessarily the photographs that come out of China. This one on the left, Zhang Yufeng, the chairman's secretary at the time and mistress, he found her because she was sent to work in Zhongnanhai in the leadership compound, and Mao Zedong was so taken by her that he wrote her name over and over again on a slip of paper and left it out, and one of his aides saw that he had written it over and over again, and he thought, aha! Maybe this person should be closer to the chairman. This comes from the Li Zhisui book about who is Mao's physician. So she's airbrushed out of this photograph of the first handshake between Mao and Nixon. Ji Chaozhou, who wrote this very interesting and readable book, The Man on Mao's Right, which I highly recommend that you read. It's a fun book, interesting book. At least it's interesting for a China geek like me. I don't know. Anyway, Ji Chaozhou was one of Zhou Enlai's people, primarily loyal to him. His older brother had been a very important secret agent inside of the Kuomintang for many, many years. And Ji Chaozhou was raised in the United States for the most part. So he spoke in New York City. So he spoke excellent English, and he actually, when he returned to China in 1949, he actually had to brush up on his Chinese. But anyway, the important part is that when Zhou Enlai was looking at these photographs and deciding which ones to put in the People's Daily and all that stuff, one night, probably right after this handshake, he decided to have Ji Chaozhou airbrushed out of the photograph, apparently because he felt that if his man was right there, being the interpreter, that would not be as good as if Wang Hairong, Mao's niece, was there. And she was an interpreter of sorts of the chairman. As we'll get into in a bit, she could understand what he was saying as his speech abilities declined with his health. But she didn't have good English. She was not actually capable of doing an interpreter role between an English and a Chinese speaker. And as you can see in this bottom photograph, she's not actually in position close enough to interpret like Ji Chaozhou is in the top photograph. Anyway, this underlines the chairman's dominant influence that we'll look at in a little bit more detail as we go. So let's skip past slide 4 and go into slide 5. Here is an overview of Mao Zedong's last years. The Kissinger trip in July of 1971, followed by the disastrous flight of Lin Biao with the crash in Mongolia, and the difficulties that the party faced in explaining this. Why did the chairman have this man by his side all these years if he was a traitor? Is the chairman telling the truth? Is the party telling the truth about this? How could this be? Maybe the truth is something different. It created a tremendous credibility problem for the party and for the state as it was trying to change course and declare that the United States could be a friend of China after decades of declaring quite the opposite. But it all succeeded. The party managed to pull it off, and indeed I have to say that over the decades, the Chinese Communist Party has managed to pull off a lot of magical tricks. Not only did they win the revolution seemingly against insurmountable odds, they turned the economy around, they managed to they screwed up things terribly, of course, in the Great Leap Forward and then in the Cultural Revolution, but then they managed to turn the country around again and actually recover, as we'll be examining in part 2 of this week's lecture and as we go into next week. So they have, one has to say, they have quite a record of complete disaster followed by unbelievable recovery. But in these last years of Mao's life, he was becoming increasingly remote. He did not want to meet so often with people anymore. He did not want to get out there and make horrid revolution anymore. He did try to push for greater unity, but his ability to speak became more and more difficult, and he needed people like Wang Hairong who could understand what he was saying, and this woman Nancy Tang who could also understand what he was saying. But we'll get more into that a little bit later. Let's now begin and discuss the opening to the United States, which isn't, there's not too much detail in the readings about it, so I want to spend a little bit of time on the opening to the United States. This began with two things. One was the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Russians in 1968 to put down a rebellion, and the other was the decision of Richard Nixon to write, while he was still a candidate for president in 1968, to write an article in the magazine Foreign Affairs to discuss the possibility of an opening to China in order to advance American interests in the Cold War. And those interests were entirely geopolitical. His article in Foreign Affairs was very realistic and very frank. And one reason for that, by the way, is that you will find that articles in specialized journals like that are read by only a few people tend to be much more truthful about what's going on than the things you'll see on television, especially, or things you'll see in the newspapers, because that level of information is intended for the voting public, and the voters are not always given a true picture of American interests and American diplomacy, as we all found out when the WikiLeaks cables became public, and we saw that U.S. diplomats were saying things in private that could not be uttered in public, which ended up being a key cause of the Arab Spring a year and a half, 2 years ago, when the Arab publics learned the extent to which the U.S. was supporting dictatorial regimes that they hated. These things happen. But anyway, Nixon's article in Foreign Affairs came to the attention of the Chinese, and they were already nervous. They were nervous because of Czechoslovakia. Why did Czechoslovakia make them nervous? Because in the wake of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, which replaced the government of Alexander Dubček, who wanted to have an opening to the West of his own. He was considered to be a dangerous traitor on the part of by the Soviets. And the Soviets, of course, wanted to maintain close control of the Warsaw Pact countries in order to protect their historically vulnerable Western front. So that was their bottom line. No deviation from Soviet control in Eastern Europe. So from this situation came the Brezhnev Doctrine. Leonid Brezhnev was the leader of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union at the time. He was the General Secretary. He was therefore the leader of the country. And Leonid Brezhnev and his aides issued this document that became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, which said any ideological deviation by a socialist country is subject to our correction from Moscow. And the correction in this case was Soviet tanks invading Czechoslovakia and arresting the leader, Alexander Dubček. So the Chinese didn't like that too much because it sort of suggested to them that they could be next. Already, as we looked at last week, the relations between the USSR and China were at an all-time hostile low, and the Chinese were concerned that the Brezhnev Doctrine could be turned against them, so they knew they needed to find a friend, and Mao Zedong commissioned a study by several senior generals, a couple of whom had been placed aside during the Cultural Revolution. He had Zhou Enlai arrange it all. They got together for about 2 weeks and talked about matters and came up with a written set of conclusions. And one of those conclusions was that China should consider an opening to the United States, leading possibly to full diplomatic relations, which could, at the same time, as it helped to promote Chinese security interests against the Soviet Union, at the same time might be used to bring some resolution over the problem of Taiwan. And so this was pursued by both sides, because each side, the Chinese and the Americans, had a great deal of interest in making it happen. And eventually, there were arrangements made for Henry Kissinger to travel to China and do the advance work for a presidential visit. He made 2 visits. And these led, let's go on to slide 7, these led to Richard Nixon's visit in 1972 in February. At the end of the month, he was there for about a week. By the way, in the Shakya book, he makes a lot of errors when it comes to things about China. He should have had somebody who studied China edit his book. On page 358, he states that the Nixon visit was in July of 1972. That's not right. It was in February. Maybe if I have time, I'll send out an email to everybody that has his erratas in it that I've noticed. They're all pretty minor, actually. It doesn't take away from his narrative on Tibet. So one of the most important parts of the Shanghai Communique was Article 12, in which the United States acknowledged that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait consider Taiwan to be part of China, and that there is only one China, not two. The thing that the Chinese absolutely did not want was for the Americans, whose uniquely powerful position in world politics was plain to all. They did not want the Americans to pursue a so-called two-China solution. And for that matter, neither did Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader on Taiwan. He considered Taiwan to be part of China. He believed that eventually, although there's some argument about how realistic this was and how much he really believed it, his official position was that eventually the KMT would try to recover the mainland. and he did not want there to be a de facto or a de jure, in name, independence of Taiwan. So Kissinger and Nixon agreed to recognize that Taiwan was a part of China, but they did not want to immediately withdraw troops and abandon Taiwan because they knew that was politically impossible. However, in the Taylor book, you'll notice some information that indicates that this is what they were promising in private, that they no longer wanted to stay by Taiwan, that they were willing to withdraw troops quickly from that island and allow the mainland to take it over. However, at that time, I think one reason why they did this was that at that time the military estimate was that the Chinese did not have the capability to make a massive amphibious landing on Taiwan and win the battle. Since that time, this issue has been a very key and sensitive one between the United States and China, because in Congress and in the public, amongst the public in general, there is no stomach for abandoning Taiwan. There is the idea that the U.S. should stick by Taiwan because it has become not only a non-totalitarian alternative, but a democratic alternative to the government on China. But we'll get into that more in a future lecture. We'll stop audio 1 here and go on to slide 8.